Alhamdulillah, bismillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala sayyidina wa habibina rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi man wala, amma ba'd. Alhamdulillah. First of all, I want to say salam to all the people that might be online, especially given that these are people that have been supporting the college and really supporting our ability to be here. Without you, we could not be here. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you, increase you, elevate you, and put blessing in all of your provision. Inshallah, and may we be exemplary executors of your trust. The topic today is on the reading of the great books of both the Western and the Muslim civilization. And these terms, to me, are problematic, partly because I think the Islamic civilization is part of the Western civilization. It's part of the Western civilization both in its immense influence on the Western civilization, but also on the fact that Islam has been a Western religion. It was in Spain for over 700 years. We forget that. And the Europeans were studying with the Muslims, learning from them, and then transmitting their knowledge. In fact, we have extraordinary records and evidence that the Muslims were troubled by the fact that they felt they were stealing their knowledge and they wouldn't attribute it to them. They would go back and pretend that it was their own. And this is a problem not just between different groups or religions, but also within the same religion. Imam Suyuti complained about a logic teacher that he had who he felt stole a text that he'd written and attributed to himself, which might be one of the reasons why he wrote a book against logic, that people that learn logic actually might corrupt their character. So I'm going to, because this is a lecture, and some of you are familiar with the last few days, so unfortunately the time that I set aside to really write this became preoccupied with other things, getting a lot of calls and things. So these are the trials of the dunya. Man wajada khayran falyahmadillah wa man wajada ghayra dhalik fala yulamanna illa nafsah. So arguably only a handful of civilizations have produced high levels of literacy in our history as a species. The earliest traces of writing emerge in what we now call the cradle of civilization, where writing, largely for administrative and marketing purposes, develops in the cuneiform script around 3200 BC. There's debates on these dates. In present-day Iraq, writing begins in Egypt around 3100 BC, and then it goes, we find writing in China around 2000. However, we know from our own tradition, and Revelation always introduces a source that is accepted by believers and with a type of certainty that they have. So it's demonstrative for them. It's a hujjah burhaniyah for the believer. We have a hadith that says that Adam alayhi salam read on the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. So we know that he had intuited the ability to read. Allah imprinted that in him, allama al-insan. And it's interesting that allama in Arabic actually means to press into. And this is exactly what the first writing is. It's writing in clay tablets, and it's literally pressing into, and we're made of clay. And so there's something that within us that's very extraordinary in that we are an impressionable species, that we can be, people can impress us, right? It's very interesting we use that word. He impressed me. It also can mean that to be impressed as a sailor's impressed. Also, it's something. So these first alphabets, which are actually known in some of the literature as abjads, emerge in Egypt from Semitic scribes who developed phonetic alphabets that can be sounded out, which will revolutionize literacy. Those early scripts then split into the Proto-Canaanite alphabet and the South Arabian alphabet. So the Arab Peninsula is early on related to writing, around 1200 BC. So Alif, Ba, Ta, the first letters of the Arabic alphabet, are embedded in the English word alphabet. The Semitic languages, which are the languages of the three great revelations of the Abrahamic tradition, which is Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew, and then Koine Greek is adopted as a canonical language of the early Christians. They're foundational to Western civilization. Both Hebrew and Arabic have been studied in the West for centuries. Harvard University in America had Arabic on its curriculum at the founding of the country. And Noah Webster's first American dictionary, which was published in 1828, and you can actually see it in facsimile, has Arabic typography. He uses Arabic and Hebrew roots with typesetting of the original Arabic, and the authors attempt to show that English had its roots in a Semitic language. So he wanted to prove that all languages came from the language of revelation. So he has very interesting, like, he'll have like cave, and then he'll put kahf, and he'll say like earth, ard, and so he'll say that English is actually from Arabic. It's a very interesting. But what's shocking to me is where did they get Arabic typography in the 1820s in the United States? I mean, that's pretty impressive, because we still don't have good typography in a lot of Muslim countries. So the Indus Valley civilization developed very early in what is now called Pakistan and northern India. The writing system developed in the Indus Valley remains a mystery to this day. They haven't penetrated it, although they know that this was a highly developed civilization that was writing at a very early stage. So this culture goes into a major decline around 1800 BC, and around 1500 BC, an invasion of Aryan cattle herders. Now remember, Aleph is the ancient word for ox, right? A is for ox. There's actually a book by Barry Sanders about that. So Aleph, which is Alif, because it's the first domesticated animal. And so these Aryan cattle herders from the north go into the area, and they introduce the beginnings of the Indo-European languages in the region that developed into two highly sophisticated Indic and Iranian languages. So the Vedas were written in Sanskrit, a sub-branch of the early Indic languages, beginning around 1800 BC. And then Greek, which is another subset of this Indo-European group, developed an alphabet in the early 8th century, which coincided with the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are two texts that are foundational to Western civilization. In fact, it was Blake, the poet, William Blake, who argued that we needed to get rid of the Iliad because he felt that the belligerence of Western civilization had a lot to do with the fact that the foundational text was a text of war. So, although China and India developed highly literate and cultured societies, I'm going to focus on the Semitic revelations and the civilizations that they engendered. The earliest known Hebrew writing goes back to King David's reign around the 10th century BC. Most scholars believe that the earliest Hebrew Bibles were dated to around the 6th century, but a lot of modern research indicates that it may have been earlier, and that some of the biblical texts may be as old as the 10th century. The Hebrew Bible, a revelation that Jews, Christians, and Muslims share, begins a civilization based upon literacy, the ability to read. So read in Arabic is a very interesting word because it comes from two roots, to reason and to riddle. In other words, reading is a puzzling out of meaning through the skills of reason, by deciphering symbols and then making sense of the meanings they convey. An oral tradition remains as an accompaniment to the written tradition that arises among the devout Jews, thus blending these two aspects of language, the spoken and the written. The word rabbi comes from a word that means master. A rabbi is someone who has mastered the Torah, and the rabbinical tradition is able to teach it to others, this rabbi. The word in the Quran is Rabbani, Kunu Rabbaniyin. It relates to it and means someone who nurtures or helps another grow. One of the Arabic words for education is tarbiyah, which is a cognate of Rabbani. So yurabbi, and Rabb al-Alameen is also the one who yurabbi, that nurtures and helps to grow. So in the early period before Christian revelation, a major event occurred that greatly changed the Semitic and Western traditions. Around the mid-3rd century, the Septuagint emerged as the earliest Koine Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This translation was widely available at the time of the Christian revelation, which was transmitted through the common language of the Mediterranean Sea, which is the Koine Greek. So Greek goes through these stages. So the early Homeric Greek, and then it moves into an Attic Greek, and then the later, the Koine Greek. which is the Greek of the New Testament. As Greeks became Christians, they introduced a lot of abstract Greek thought into Semitic tradition, and the beginnings of a unique hybrid civilization arose that transformed much of the Western world and how it understood the world and its purpose. So as Greek culture arose out of a crucible of poetry, drama, and philosophy, the epic poems of Homer, the great tragedies and comedies of the Greek dramatists of the 4th and 3rd centuries in BC, and the profound pre-Socratics, such as Heraclitus, were followed by the most influential philosophers probably of human history, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The Roman Empire, which benefited greatly from Greek thought, displayed a much more practical approach to life than the Greeks. The Stoic philosophy, rhetoric, law, and history, and obviously some poetry and drama, these become the major obsessions of the Romans. So the classical civilizations succumbed over time to immense Christian influence, resulting in the conversion of one of the greatest intellects and scholars of the ancient world, St. Augustine. His works introduced a powerful approach to Christianity, influenced heavily by Greek, especially Platonic thought. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and he was a great liberal artist, and he has a book called On Christian Doctrine, and makes, I think, a very cogent argument for the importance of understanding things like rhetoric for understanding Revelation because of the dangers and possibilities of misinterpretation. And one of the things that Shaykh Hamza Yusuf told me is that his father, the great scholar Ibrahim al-Yaqubi, said that almost all of the heresies of the Islamic tradition come out of a lack of knowledge of grammar and rhetoric. That these are the tools that are really necessary to penetrate a lot of the abstruse aspects of Revelation. The classical civilization, so as the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and he witnessed this collapse, so he writes The City of God, because in essence we're always collapsing. This is just part of life on earth. If we might be flourishing in one place, but in another place, it's collapsing. And this is just, it's life on earth. And that these things move around in different places. So Augustine witnessed this, and during the 5th and early 6th century, you see a decline in the classical learning and also in learning in general in the West. This comes to be known as the Dark Ages, which are not as dark as a lot of Western modernist historians would argue. There were very interesting things going on during this period in the West, but there was also real limitations. So what you'll see, what's really fascinating in Western timelines, when they show the history of Western thought, they go up to the late 5th century with Augustine, and then suddenly it's black until the 13th century. And literally this is kind of a interstitial space where nothing is happening. Well, something was happening, obviously, and we know what was happening, that Islam was unleashed on the ancient world and had an immense rate of success. I mean, arguably, if you look, there's very interesting something online that shows the spread of religions in timeline. And when it gets to Islam, the other religions spread very slowly. But when it gets to Islam, it literally just goes whoosh. It's just amazing. And no other religion really had that. And partly because it came at a time where things were collapsing. And so it was really an answer to the prayers of a lot of people. And if you want to see a beautiful, I think, presentation of this idea, it's in Juan Cole's book, Muhammad, Prophet of Peace Amidst a Clash of Empires. So what's interesting in the Quran, the very first revelation in terms of its timeline is Iqra, read, which also means recite. So the oral and the literal tradition are embedded in the first word. And this is something very important because we come out of orality. As children, we are in the oral tradition. We come out of orality, and it's very important to recognize that our primeval state is a state of orality, and primitive peoples remain in that state. And in that way, in some ways, they remain children. There's a type of innocence that goes with that way of being. It's not to say that there aren't immense problems, and you can study the extraordinary violence of a lot of pre-modern societies. But we are people of civilization. We don't succumb to the fallacy of primitivism. This is a kind of Rousseauian fallacy of this idea of the state of nature as this wonderful, beautiful thing. In the Edenic sense, it is, like we believe in the garden. But in terms of coming down here, no. Right, we're enemies of one another. This is a place that has an immense amount of enmity, and part of the purpose of religion is to introduce this Pax Islamica, Pax Romanica, Pax, Christianica. This is really at the root of religions, is a spreading of peace amidst the animosity and enmity that's very common amongst human beings. So as Muslims spread throughout the Byzantine and Persian empires, they were confronted by new and often highly literate and cultured peoples. So the Prophet ﷺ's dictate that wisdom is the lost property of the believer led to a kind of syncretic approach to knowledge. So Muslims, and also seek knowledge unto China, which despite the fact that a lot of people say, oh, it's a weak hadith, or it's quoted by Ibn Abdul Barr, Hafid al-Maghrib, in his book on Kitab al-Ilm, and clearly he understood its meaning to be absolutely sound. So Muslims have never shied away from using that to support the pursuit of knowledge, even from cultures that are not our own. So this syncretic approach, you really see it during the early Abbasid period, when you had Greek, Persian, and Indian works being translated into Arabic. Many of them were done by Christian, some of them were converts, but some of them, like Yahya ibn Adi and others, they remained in their Christian tradition. And they were Syriac Christians, which is very important. They were not Byzantines. And tomorrow, inshallah, we're releasing a really, really extraordinary 5-minute video that Philip Penn did for us, who's written 2 books on when Christians first met Muslims. And he argues that literally half of the Christian world was under the Muslims. And he said that many of them were very happy to be under the Muslims, and the Syriac history shows that and reveals that, because they had been oppressed under the Byzantines. So when the Muslims came, they didn't distinguish between the sects of Christianity, and they believed in freedom of religion. Unfortunately, over time, the Muslims get harsher and harsher with these minority communities. But the early communities are quite stunning in their ability to work. And he points out that many Christians reached high levels in the early Muslim ethos. I mean, we have Qadi Ismail, who was one of the great Maliki Qadis of Baghdad, in Dibaj al-Mudahab. Ibn Farhun mentions a story where Qadi Ismail was visited by a Greek minister, a Christian minister in the Abbasid dynasty. And he got up and stood up for him. And some of the other ulama that were in the gathering were upset about it, because they said, we don't stand for. When they left, he said, this man is in charge of the affairs of the Muslims, and he's in this position, and we should honor him. And then he quoted the ayah that Allah la yanhaakum an alladhina lam yuqatilukum fid din. God does not prohibit you from showing bir, respect, bir al-walidain, to those who don't fight you or oppose you in the religion. So he said this was bir that I was showing. And Ibn Farhun says, هَذَا مِنْ فِقْهِ هَذَا الرَّجُلِ. This is from the deep understanding of this man. And there are many Muslims, unfortunately, that don't have that level of enlightenment. So it's quite stunning what's happening. There's immense amount of confusion and creativity. Because with all these new ideas, the Muslims are grappling with this civilization that was highly developed, highly theological. The Muslims were not originally a theological tradition. They were closer to the Jewish concept. It was a much more legally based tradition. The theology of the Quran is, we know that a very sophisticated theology can be extrapolated from it, but the presentation of theology in the Quran is very easy to comprehend and understand. And this is why Surah Al-Ikhlas is an extraordinary testimony to the theology of Islam. Because if you understand Surah Al-Ikhlas, you understand the essential theology of our religion. I mean, it's quite stunning that the third of the Quran, according to the hadith, and something that every Muslim knows. And if you really understand that, you will know the 8 things that are in our theology about our Lord. So this literacy springs up. And then something extraordinary happens. In the 8th century, the Muslims capture some Chinese, and they knew how to make paper. Paper is invented. Does anybody know who invented paper? Anybody? We should all know his name, because we owe so much to this man. I think Father Francisco. Do you know who invented paper? Cai Lun. Cai Lun. He was a Chinese, first century Chinese. He invented paper. I mean, just think of what we owe to this man to discover paper. And so these Chinese taught the Muslims how to make paper. Paper doesn't come into the West till much later. So this, and kaghed, they called it, they had different words for it. Qirtas, one of the things about, it's very interesting that, you know, painting was not prohibited by some of the ulama, because the idea of writing on the leather was not considered prohibited. There are many of the early scholars that said that what was prohibited was 3-dimensional. So painting 2-dimensional forms was actually not a prohibition. It's very interesting. And we know that the Prophet had a curtain in it with drawings on it that he asked to remove because it distracted him in prayer. But he would have never allowed it in the house if it was something prohibited in that way. So with Hindi numerals, which are learned from the Indians, and mathematical problems of determining qibla and inheritance distribution, new forms of geometry and algebra were developed. Sir David King argues that the Muslim obsession with the qibla determination did a great deal to advance the development of mathematics. Because in the early period, they debated, should we go by the great circle or by just a compass direction? Al-Biruni argued for the great circle. The fuqaha said it's too difficult. It's taklif ma la yutaq, because it means you have to learn mathematics to determine qibla. And so the fuqaha rejected that. But David King said it did much to advance. One of the things in the Quran is that Allah put everything in a reckoning, لِتَعْلَمُوا عَدَدَ السَّنِينَ وَالْحِسَابِ, so that you learn how to calculate your years and mathematics. So it's the stars that enabled us to learn mathematics. And the Muslims were obsessed with Euclid's elements. This is a fact. The number of manuscripts of Euclid's elements is quite extraordinary. Every scholar worth his weight went through the 13 books. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi says in his Rihla that by the age of 15 he'd completed the books of Euclid and could make a working astrolabe at 15. What's studied in modern high school geometry is a minute portion of Euclid's geometry. And if you've never done the 47th proof in book 1, you should do it. It's very interesting to prove a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Because the book is a book of logic. It's teaching us how to prove what we see and understand about quantity. So the mapping of the skies was another area of immense pursuit. Aristotle's works were translated into Arabic by Greek-speaking Arabs, and also Plotinus's Aeneads were translated. It was called the Theology of Aristotle. So they actually thought that Aristotle had written it. And then the Nicomachean Ethics was standard reading and becomes literally the foundation of virtue ethics. It was later rooted in the Quran and Sunnah, first by Raghib al-Isfahani, who took Miskawi's reworking of Aristotle's text, and then Abu Hamid, Imam al-Ghazali, in his Mizan al-Amal, and then Nasiruddin al-Tusi in his Akhlaq al-Tusi, which is an amazing book that's been translated into English. It's a good translation, written originally in Persian, later translated into Arabic, but it's a stunning work, and he was one of the great polymaths of Islam. So these are foundational texts in virtue ethics. So the development of the Islamic civilization continued as a vibrant and creative tradition well into the 13th and 14th century, moving from place to place with different peoples. Excuse me. The sophisticated isnad system developed that resulted in certain books becoming canonical. So this is very important. There were certain books that literally became absolutely necessary for a scholar to study. Had he not studied them, it was as if he really hadn't studied. And this is very important. And the vast majority of them have sanad, or a chain of transmission, back to the original author. And one of the extraordinary things, Foucault has a theory about the archaeology of knowledge, that looking at knowledge is like looking at archaeological sites. We can't really understand what Plato was saying because we're trying to piece it together as if it was an archaeological site. I think the Isnad tradition really refutes that argument because for instance, Ibn Ashir, a text that I studied pretty extensively and wrote a lot on and translated, and have read many commentaries on it. Ibn Ashir's text was commented by his best student, Sidi Mayyara, in a very large sharh. So we know exactly what Ibn Ashir meant in that text. And then our lexicons are extraordinary, so we know what words mean. So I think that there's some real interesting area to refute these type of ideas. Even the peripatetic tradition has unbroken chains of transmission. It didn't die out. It might have died out in some places, but it was going on in other places. So these within the Catholic tradition, the Dominicans have had an unbroken chain of transmission of their philosophy for centuries. So it's very important to recognize the absolute essence of the Isnad tradition in this. And then didactic poetry emerges because of an immense reliance on memory, especially with the ancillary sciences. Because the idea that what didactic poems are is that they're using the Rajaz meter, which is, they call it the donkey of the poets, Himar al-Shu'ara, because it's easy to ride, right? And so these were written because they were easy to memorize. And so they acted as memory pegs. So you would learn the commentary, and if you know the baits, then you would know, if you recited the baits, وَمَالِكٌ وَسَائِرُ الْأَئِمَّةِ كَذَا أَبُو الْقَاسِمِ هُدَاةَ الْأُمَّةِ, right? In the Jawhara, he says, فَوَاجِبُ تَقْرِيدِ حِبْرٍ مِّنْهُمُ كَذَا حَكَى الْقَوْمُ بِلَبْدٍ يُفْهَمُ. So that will jar your memory. Okay, Malik and the other imams, and in the commentaries they say the mushtahidun, these are the guides of this ummah, and like that Abu al-Qasim in Tasawwuf, Abu al-Qasim al-Junayd. So it's obligatory to follow one of them if you're not a mushtahid. So that's a memory peg for somebody, and then so scholars learned these texts and recited them, right? So if you learn the Jazariya, then you would know what the 17 points of articulation are, because they're enunciated in the Jazariya, each one, the Jawf, and then the Halq, and then the Lisan, and so forth. So that was very important. Then you got commentaries, super commentaries, all these glosses on them. In Al-Andalus, this becomes an immense center of Islamic scholarship, and Europeans at the time were in awe of the Muslims and began studying with them. Jewish scholars often wrote in Arabic and acknowledged the learning from the Muslims, such as the sciences of lexicology, prosody, and others that were unknown to them before. The Jewish tradition has learned an immense amount from our tradition. In fact, there was a rabbi recently who wrote an article that it was Islam that saved Judaism, and that had the religion of Islam not emerged in the 7th century, he said it would have been very likely that the religion would have disappeared. Now, this is a Jewish historian who made this argument. This is online, his paper. And then Arabic numerals, which develop out of Hindi numerals. So when you see Hindi Arabic numerals, it's not really fair, because the Hindi numerals that you all know from Eastern texts printed, if you buy a text in Morocco, they're in Arabic numerals, which are the ones we use, which are based on geometrical angles. So 7, that's why European 7 has that cross. It had 7 angles. 2 had 2 angles. 4 had 4 angles. So they were literally geometric representations of numbers. The Hindi numbers are not like that. So the Arabic numerals are what we use. Now they call them Hindi Arabic. They used to call them Arabic numerals, but I think the Indian lobby is very strong. So they got that in there. They're smart people, and They're ahead of us in the United States, with respect and hats off to their efforts. So, as Muslim knowledge slowly seeped into Europe through Spain and the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a veritable renaissance of knowledge explodes throughout Europe. The two great Christian and Muslim civilizations together produced an extraordinary output of scholarship: philosophy, theology, literature, grammar, linguistics, mathematics. There's an argument by this grammarian Owens, he's a linguist, who makes an argument that the Orientalists in the 19th century were not capable of understanding the mutawwalat, the extensive works of the Arab grammarians from Iraq, because he said that they did not have the tools of modern linguistics. And many of the concepts of modern linguistics were already being presented 1,000 years before the West got to them by Arabic grammarians. So he's making an argument that the entire corpus of Arabic grammar needs to be reassessed in the light of modern linguistics. And I know of a PhD which I actually had and gave to Dr. Omar Abdullah Farouk, of a Palestinian, making an argument that generative grammar was actually taken from Iraqi grammarians. That was his argument about Chomsky. Who knows Arabic? Maybe he was inspired and just riffed off of it. Who knows? So, so at Zaytuna, we're attempting to understand two traditions. One is difficult enough. So to understand two, because we are a hybrid ummah now, we can't deny the impact that the West has had on us. The West has had an immense impact on the globe. And to deny that and to not understand this civilization and not recognize some of the extraordinary aspects of the civilization that have given them so much power and sweep around the globe, for good and ill. So undeniably, there are many, many great aspects of the civilization. And then there are other aspects that are deeply troubling, like any great civilization. So Western civilization has been on the rise for over 500 years and seems to be in serious crises today, despite its continued dynamism. The Christian foundation has eroded considerably in the last 300 years, and arguably today it barely exists in many parts of Western Europe. In England, the Church of England is in major crises. The Catholic Church in Europe is in major crises. In fact, Africa and Asia are seen as much more fruitful areas of development of the church because of this decline. Atheism is on the rise. Even in the United States, we're seeing nuns as a new N-O-N, not N-U-N, nuns, nonis, as a new phenomenon. People that don't ascribe to any religion. Not all of them are atheists. Many of them say they don't like to organize religion, which I always say, join the Muslims. We're the most disorganized religion in the world. So now looking at tradition and getting into the canon. Tradition comes from a root word that means to give over, impart, or surrender. But it can also mean to betray. Very interesting. In Arabic, we say turath as an inheritance, but we also say naql, right? So we have ulum al-naqliya and ulum al-aqliya. We have the ulum al-naqliya, right? وَدَلِيلُهُ, is a transmitted dalil is in its dilalat, obviously, but it's also in its sahha. So على الناقل الصحة وعلى المدعي الدليل. The dalil al-aql ma'a nafsihi. So an intellectual proof is with itself, QED. Like you can show it that either it's dhanni or qat'i, and that's a whole other usuli departure into epistemology. So the greatest tradition we have after our revelation for those who are believers is language itself. So we forget that language is tradition. That the language that we're speaking was given to us by our parents, and its development was through our teachers, especially those who taught us to read and understand a sentence and the parts of speech that make up a sentence and what they do, which is essential. And that's why the essence of grammar is in the parts of speech, not in punctuation. Punctuation is an afterthought of grammar. Our cultures have traditions that we hand down. Some of our traditions probably should have been jettisoned a long time ago. For instance, a child who asked her mother why she always cut off the top of the turkey at Thanksgiving, she responded to her daughter, "It's a family tradition. Ask grandma when she comes." So when her grandmother came, the child asked her to explain the reason behind this tradition. The grandma said, I have no idea why your mother does it. My oven was too small for the turkeys, so that's why I had to do it. So in the life of Brian, a movie, blasphemous for many, I think arguably, but in there's a scene that shows Brian, this kind of feckless Middle Easterner, who's believed by simpletons to have become some sort of prophet, and he's running away from this mob that's chasing him, and he loses a sandal. And as he's running away from his admiring mob, one of those chasing him sees the sandal and said, he's left us a sign. And then he picks up the sandal, let us all remove one sandal. This is mocking a type of tradition that undeniably exists in many religious communities. This, when you see, and I don't want to make light of this at all, but when you see rabbis in the Middle East wearing the Polish dress of aristocrats from the 17th century, one wonders about that tradition. It's very interesting why the hat, these hats and the fur, but this is from Poland. It was what they wore in a certain historical time, but it's become their tradition. And you will see this amongst Muslims also, who have these type of traditions, often dress. There's no traditional dress. There's only modesty. The Prophet ﷺ wore many different clothes, I think, to show that there's no specific dress of Islam. He had a Roman robe that was dayyq. It said that it was tight. It was very interesting. And then he had a Habashi, he had an Ethiopian shirt that was given to him by Habib. And when she gave it to him, he said Sena. He used the Ethiopian word to say it's nice. It's so nice. He had a jubba from Yemen. So I think what he was showing us, and Imam al-Juwayni said that clothes should always follow the urf of a people, that Muslims should not be alien. If they're visitors and wearing their traditional clothes, that's one thing. But he says, if you wear alien clothes, the ignorant amongst them will attack you. Right? Because they see it, it's foreign. Imam al-Tartushi was on a boat with Qadi Abu Bakr going to Andalus, and when he prayed, he did qabd. He was Maliki, but he had tarjih of qabd, like he preferred that position. In Andalusia, they did sadal. The sailors said this is a spy from the east, and they wanted to throw him over the boat, which is a proof that you really should do what people, when in Rome, do as the Romans, as long as it's not ma'asiyah. But you really should try to do what people do, to not be strange. And I think one of the great geniuses of our civilization is the fact that we indigenize wherever we went. The architecture was always indigenous. If you go to Fremont, there's a mosque that looks just like the Taj Mahal. Muslims never did that. This is a modernist form of Islam. Because, well-intentioned Indians, and may Allah reward them for their generosity, wanted to bring something of home back to them. So they ignored California colonial, which is actually Andalusian architecture, that would have fit into the place. So now when somebody drives by, they see Islam as an alien thing. It's from India. Whereas the Muslims always, the great mosques of Andalusia look exactly like Visigothic churches. The great churches of Turkey mosques of Turkey look exactly like Byzantine. The pagodas of the Buddhists become the mosques of China. And then the Mughal mosque look like Hindu temples. I mean, it's quite stunning. I don't know how they did that, if it was just ilham from Allah. But it's something worth researching, because it's really quite stunning that they were able to really see that Islam is not a culture. It's something that transcends culture, that purifies culture, that enters into culture and has this wonderful effect on the indigenous culture by removing the dross, by purifying it. So in the Vindication of Tradition, Jaroslav Pelikan quotes from Jerome Robbins. I don't know if anybody saw the play or the film Fiddler on the Roof, but Fiddler on the Roof is a play about tradition and about the dissolution of tradition amongst the Jews in Russia. And that's why the very first song is called Tradition. Robbins says, well, if it's a play about tradition and its dissolution, it's ending, it's falling apart, unraveling, then the audience should be told what the tradition is. He comments on this, Jaroslav Pelikan, this statement of Jerome Robbins deserves to be raised to the status of what Immanuel Kant, in his definition of the categorical imperative, called a maxim of universal law. The maxim applies above all to education, whose young audience should be told what the tradition is as a part of the record of its dissolution. For even if, or especially if, the tradition of our past is a burden that the next generation finally drop, it will not be apt to drop it or to understand why it must drop it unless it has some sense of what its content is and of how and why it has persisted for so long. The tradition does not have to be understood to be dominant, as Zdzislaw Mulovs has observed. Certainly, the illiterates of the past centuries, then an enormous majority of mankind, knew little of the history of their respective countries and their civilization, and yet their lives were decisively shaped by that history. One of the things that you'll find in traditional Muslim cultures is that you will have very simple Muslims whose metaphysics of the Islamic tradition comes from popular poetry. If you go to Morocco, there's something called the Fayashia, which every Moroccan who has any tie to Islam knows, very often by heart. They can all sing it. It's almost the national anthem of Morocco. أنا مالي في عيش شاعر مني أخلق من رزق الله والخالق يخلقني. I should be afraid of provision when I know the Creator praised me. من نطفة صورني, He created me as a embryo, and then I came out and He clothed me and He's fed me. Why should I fear now? So that poetry was teaching simple Muslims about Tawheed, and about not being afraid, and about not fear. And you will find many Persians and Afghans and Pakistanis that know Iqbal poetry, that know Rumi, that know Jami', that know Sa'di, and know profound metaphysical truths, even though they couldn't articulate them in some kind of a way that you might learn here at the college when you're studying these things in a class. But they know them in a very deep way, in an existential way. So knowledge of the traditions that have shaped us for good or ill, and some of both, is not a sufficient preparation for the kind of future that will face our children and our grandchildren in the 21st century. Not a sufficient preparation, but a necessary preparation. The rediscovery of tradition belongs to the design of the curriculum and to the definition of the goals and content of a general education. Also, in a nation that has, like ours in the United States, if I may say so, traditionally been more hungry for its future than its past. That rediscovery is made possible and made necessary by the continuity of tradition. What Edmund Burke, a great Irish statesman, said, he called it a partnership in all science, all art, all virtue. And then Burke added, as the ends of such a partnership cannot be obtained in many generations, it becomes a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. So we're in a chain, and we represent a link in that chain. We are the link of the present, but we are linked to the past. I'm speaking before you in the language of Shakespeare. This is the language of Shakespeare. This is modern English. It's changed, but we can still understand. To be or not to be, that is the question. All of you understand what that means. I mean, maybe not in its in the depths of its meaning, but we certainly know what the words mean. And that, come to think of it, is not a bad definition of a living tradition. The best definition of tradition I've ever seen is that it's the living faith of the dead, and that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Van Doren, in his book Liberal Education, calls this the great tradition, and he says it's always present. So we have a great tradition in the Islamic civilization that it's present in the civilization. The geometry of our masters is present in the buildings that surround them. The love of beauty when they dress in their traditional clothes on the Eid, the tradition of ihsan, and khudu zinatakum 'inda kulli masjid. It's there in the way they dress on the Eid days. These are things. So he says it consists of the liberal arts, literary and mathematical, because they control thinking. We think qualitatively and quantitatively, and this is why these arts were so important. And equally it consists in the great works in which meaning has been given, the ideal statement that human life is itself an art. If this is true, the curriculum for any college may be simply described. The 4 years of every student will be devoted to 2 principal and simultaneous activities: learning the arts of investigation, discovery, criticism, and communication, and achieving firsthand an acquaintance with the original books, the unkillable classics in which these miracles have happened. If men were angels, they could dispense with tradition, for they would know all things at once. And if they were animals, they could do nicely with instinct as a substitute. But we must learn, and learn painfully, by accumulation and in time. Tradition is dangerous to the intellect, which does not know how to love it, for it can weigh heavily upon weak heads. To accept it is to borrow trouble, for it heaves with controversies and unanswered questions. It has been said that to inherit the tradition of a democracy is like inheriting a lawsuit. And this goes for tradition in general. We've inherited a lawsuit. There are still questions that haven't been answered. There's still ongoing debates that we have to grapple with anew. But tradition is most dangerous and most troublesome when it is forgotten. It gives strength as well as takes it. It brings life as well as threatens it. It is life fighting to maintain itself in time. For there is the curious fact that tradition is never so healthy as when it is being fought. We deny its authority, but in doing so, we use its clearest terms. And end, if we are original in enriching it, that it may have strength for future wars. Its orthodoxy at its best, thriving on heresies, which it digests into nobler problems. To study a civilization, to understand it, we have to understand its worldview. This is exactly what Sayyid Naqib al-Attas is arguing. You have to understand the worldview of Islam if you want to understand this religion. And to know that, we must examine its tradition through its seminal works. While defining, so that's Van Doren's quote. While defining the canon of either Christian or Muslim civilization is not an easy task, it remains a task that can, to a large extent, be done. Differences as to what to include or exclude will occur, but many of the books will be easily identifiable. For example, in the Western tradition, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Plato's dialogues, the Greek tragedies, and certainly the Bible in Western Christianity. If you read, for instance, Aristophanes' Assembly Women, you'll see that these things that we're grappling with today, the Greeks were dealing with the same. The women in the play are fed up with the men's inability to govern the state. So they decide to take over the assembly. This is what's happening today. It's not a different problem. In the Muslim world, the Quran and Hadith remain the fountainheads of all inspiration. From these 2 sources, we have Imam Tabari's history, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, Imam al-Ghazali's Tahafud, and Ibn Rushd's response, because this is at the essence of a tradition, is ultimately a conversation. Scholars are reading books and responding to books. And this is happening constantly. We have the Jahili Odes. We have Mutanabbi's Diwan. You can't ignore the Diwan of al-Mutanabbi. Rumi's Mathnawi. And the list goes on. These are what Van Doren called the unkillable classics. They remain the wellsprings of literacy for both our civilizations. To not know Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari in the Muslim world is to me the same thing as being ignorant of Hamlet in the West. Right? Every Westerner knows Hamlet. But if you don't know Abu al-Fath al-Iskandari, I think you're missing something very important in the history of Muslim civilization. Aside from our respective revelations, which we hold to be sui generis, it's just on its own. These and the other great classics of the 2 civilizations testify to the pinnacles of human excellence. I once saw Charles Van Doren, who was a friend of my father's, and Mortimer Adler, who was also a close friend of my father's and one of my teachers. He was teaching him how to classify books. I mean, he knew how to do it, but they were doing it for a television program. And so he's putting, imaginative literature like Daniel Defoe, sacred history, Dante, or poetry, sacred poetry. Then he gets to the Bible. He said, "Oh, this is sui generis. It's on its own. This is revelation." And then Charles Van Doren, who was very secular, and Adler, who was not, and who had a great respect for Muslims because he knew Avicenna, he knew the influence of the Muslims, he knew the Arabian influence on Western civilization. Adler says, what do we do with the Quran? And I was like, oh God, is he going to say imaginative literature? And Adler said, oh, that's very easy, right next to the Bible. Revelation. That's an acknowledgement from somebody outside of the faith that this is a sacred text. A huge number of people on the planet hold this text to be revealed by God, and we should respect it as that. So, their study provides us with endless resources for reflection, these great books, Insight and Human Growth. To know the great literature of any civilization is to know ourselves better, as that literature speaks to the universal that resides in our particular mortal lodging. The masters of epic and lyrical poetry, drama, and of late the novel are the great observers of the nature within us and the nature without. They help us see what we would so easily miss without their prodding to look closer. But it is only through experience that our readings come to life in ways that surprise us, as we ripen into an understanding that we often missed without that experience. Sir Richard Livingston, one of my favorite authors, the great classicist of the last century and defender of classical education, wrote, "Read Homer and Horace by all means," says Newman. "Feed the mind and eye and ear with their images and the language and music, but do not expect to understand what they are really talking about before you are 40. This truth was brought home to me more than 30 years ago, one December day, as I walked down the road from Argentieres to Chamonix after a snowfall. And suddenly, from the abyss of my unconscious memory, a line of Virgil rose into my mind, and I found myself repeating, sed iacet agaribus nivius informis et alto terra gelu. I had read the words at school and no doubt translated them glibly. The earth lies formless under snowdrifts and deep frost. But suddenly, with the snow scene before my eyes, I perceived for the first time what Virgil meant by the epithet informis, without form. I literally wept the first time I read this. And how perfectly it describes the work of snow, which literally does make the world formless, blurring the sharp outlines of roofs and eaves of pines and rocks and the mountain ridges, taking form, their definiteness of shape and form. Yet how many times before that day had I read the words without seeing what they really meant? It is not that the word informis meant nothing to me when I was an undergraduate, but it meant much less than its full meaning. Personal experience was necessary to real understanding. So I had a similar experience to Sir Richard many years ago. I was walking on a path in the woods, and I noticed that the leaves on the walking path were black. And I had really never noticed that before about a path. And what came to my mind was a poem that I memorized a long time ago, The Road Not Taken. So I'd never really seen that leaves are trodden black by our footsteps. And Frost says, in leaves no step had trodden black. In the words of Frost, it struck me as a powerful sign for so much of human impact in the world. We darken by our actions so much of the world. The Quran reminds us that the servants of the merciful tread lightly upon the earth. We talk today of a heavy carbon footprint. In any case, great poets, dramatists, novelists, historians, and biographers have much to reveal to us about the human heart. If you read the section in Crime and Punishment of Dostoevsky, who I think probably knew the human heart better than anybody other than a prophet. I mean, his knowledge of the human heart. If you want to understand the internet and trolls and bloggers, you just read Notes from Underground. It's all in there. But he's got this where this man who's murdered this woman, he's in this delirium, but he has this incredible vision of just the world going mad and everybody turning on everybody. It's quite stunning. So it makes us more reflective, introspective, ultimately more human and thus more humane. Experience enhances our own personal awakening to what we encounter in the world of the mind, but we can certainly learn by the experience of others. An immense difference exists between a man who reads the history of the Peloponnesian War and one who has lived through one, with the terrors and trials searing his soul with permanent scars. But we can learn from Thucydides, who wrote the book hoping that maybe people would learn to avoid what the Greeks had gone through and the devastation it had on his people. Many great books and works of art, whether poetry or plays, exist, but the art is long and life is brief. So how do we recognize a work worth our precious time? The hallmark of a great book, as the poet Ezra Pound said, is that it's news that stays news. A great book or work of art is both timeless and timely. It speaks to every time because of the universal truths embedded in the particular circumstances that it arose out of. When we read Rumi, a poet of great depth and knowledge of the human heart, he speaks to us from Konya centuries ago, but in words that signify truths as relevant for us today as when he uttered them. In his shrine in Konya, people from all over the planet make pilgrimage. When we were there, and we visited several times, Japanese and Americans and Canadians and Europeans and people from all over the Muslim world were drawn to him because of the profound impact that his words had on their hearts. Even in translation, he has had the good fortune of great translators. The beauty of his images and the words penetrate our hearts over the span of 800 years. He tells us, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I'm changing myself. Reminding us of the importance of spheres of influence, the self and the spheres of concern, the world. Too many of us focus on concerns that we have little or no power over and miss the great opportunity of having an immense impact on the world by being the change in ourselves that we desire to see in the world. When he asks us, if you are irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished? He gives us a great insight into the nature of vexation and its purpose in the world. When I was a child, this is myself, my mother had a poem of Rumi on her wall in her bedroom. And I read that poem so many times that I actually memorized it. I was probably about 10 years old. It went like this: the heart is like grain. We are like the mill. How does the mill know why it turns? The body's the millstone, the water its thoughts. The stone says, the water knows its course. The water asks, ask the miller. He's the one who sends this water cascading down. The miller says, if there is no turning, O bread eater, there will be no dough. Turn and turn again. Silence. Ask God. He will tell you. And I just was so, what does that mean? And as a young boy across the bay, right, not very far from here, a half hour, I was contemplating in the 60s a poem written in Konya hundreds of years ago. Feeling that there was in it some secret. So my first experience with a poem, though, that hit me in the gut and took my breath away was in the 8th grade in Miss Augusta Nelly's class. The poem was Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. And it was the lines, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. And what I realized in that moment, I really remembered this very distinctly, was something about time and the impermanence of the world and the pomp and circumstance and something essentially empty about the world. And it actually terrified me. So my father, who taught poetry at the university level and actually wrote a treatise on prosody, read and reread and recited from memory a handful of poems that he contemplated for decades. One of the last conversations we had was on a Frost poem. I once read a poem by Hamza on her brother's death, and it reduced me to tears. What struck me was that a 1,400-year-old poem could have had that effect on me. But I was overjoyed when a few years later I was reading a hadith that related that the Prophet ﷺ cried upon hearing a poem.
by Khansa about the death of her brother. So I was just happy that the same words that made the Prophet ﷺ cry made me cry. You know, just amazing that can happen over generations. The Prophet's house was filled with the highest quality of literature. His wife Aisha knew all of the Jahili poetry. She was a rawiya. Abu Bakr was a rawi. These are people that memorize and transmit the poems of the Arabs. And she obviously learned that from her father. And if you wish to see the literary quality of the Prophet's household, read the hadith of Zara. That has many commentaries, and some are purely literary. The pre-Islamic poetry has been a prerequisite for the understanding of the Quran, because if you can penetrate real poetry, it enables you to understand language in a way that is other people just do not have access to it. And that's why some people hate poetry. Like, why doesn't he just say what he means? Right? There's this real frustration that people have with poets. But they are saying what they mean. They're just not giving you a profound answer very easily. They want you to work for it because they know where it came from. And it's a place that they don't want to reveal that quickly. So there's a chapter entitled the Poets, the Shu'ara, which indicates the momentous nature of poetry in the lives of men. Great books and works of art must also be the finest examples of the quality of language. So this is a hallmark. They must be highly readable. They're also largely intended for a general readership. Any educated person can penetrate their meanings. This does not mean that there aren't highly esteemed works of scientists or scholars that aren't great, on the contrary. But generally, the greatest works are accessible and not abstruse or impenetrable. Moreover, they can be read again and again, and upon each reading, one feels that he or she is reading a book for the first time. Another quality of the work is that it deals with the most important subjects of life on earth, the great, what Adler calls the great ideas. The writer has something significant to say about the human condition. In one list, works like Ihya Ulumuddin, you will find that the author grapples with all the major themes of life on earth. He begins with knowledge and ends with the book of death, 40 books. And 40 is a sacred number in the Quran. And he does it in ways that makes his book as relevant today as when it was written. And then he displays a stunning ability to present his ideas in flawless form that dazzles the reader with its beauty and substance. One mistake about judging great books is the idea that they're absolute repositories of truth to make them great. Many of the greatest works of our species have egregious mistakes, sometimes flawed by faulty logic, sometimes by not having the requisite knowledge at the time to discern the truth of one's topic. And we find in the great science works of the past, such as Ptolemy's Almagest. But the work still, the Almagest still has continued relevance as a valid way of experiencing the night sky from a geocentric perspective that emerges from our existential experience of it, and its position in the pantheon of man's progress in astronomy remains unchallenged. Authors often contradict themselves, as no human work rises to perfection without being devoid of logical flaws. The Quran states about its revelation, had this been from other than God, you would have found much contradiction in it. Walt Whitman, I think, says this best about each one of us as a human being. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. Another reason, and that's why Tawbah is important. If you make mistakes in things that are momentous, I mean, we can make mistakes in stupid things and just feel stupid. But if they're momentous, then it's important to repent. Another reason why we read certain books, despite the many truths we might glean from them, lies in what we learn by discovering the flaws within them. So good reading demands critical reading. Good reading is critical reading. Nietzsche states that, quote, "It is certainly not the least charm of a theory that it is refutable. It is with precisely this charm that it entices subtler minds. A great work also evokes within us the triad of transcendentals, the truth and goodness and beauty. We are far more likely to encounter this triad in the great works of the past than today for a number of reasons, the least of which involves the impoverished education of today and the loss of a mastery of the arts that enables the production of great works. Certainly one of the greatest benefits of reading the great works of the past is an acquired immunity against the follies of the present. C.S. Lewis reminds us that we need intimate knowledge of the past, not that the past has any magic about it, but because we need something to set us against the present. A man who has lived in many places is not likely to be deceived by the local errors of his native village. The person who knows the past has lived in many times and is therefore to some degree immune from the great cataract of nonsense that pours from the press and microphone of his own age. We might add that to that, I think, the iPhone. A knowledge of the past. Great works have lasting impact on us, sometimes less consciously than we're even aware. Italo Calvino, in his Why Read the Classics, reminds us that, quote, the classics are books that exert a peculiar influence both when they refuse to be eradicated from the mind and when they conceal themselves in the folds of memory. And so, just a few guidelines about how not to read a great work other than Revelation. Don't read these great works as a duty. Right? They're actually incredibly pleasurable. These works are immensely entertaining. If one doesn't grab you, grab another, unless it's assigned reading. Then hopefully the teacher will help unlock its mysteries, especially in great literature. Don't simply read for ideas. I'm almost done. So don't simply read for ideas that one can discern. The works work on us if they are indeed masterpieces. You cannot go through the 40 books of the Ihya Ulum ad-Din properly without being transformed in the process. It's just simply a fact. The architectonic structure of that book is stunning. The sheer beauty of great literature can reduce a sensitive person to tears. That recognition of beauty is a recognition of the divine in that work. It's a tajalli of the Jamal of Allah that's in that work. This is what the Sufi tradition calls the fails. You know, fail. The inspiration of the person that put that there, his hal, is being transmitted to you. God is beautiful and loves beauty. Don't venerate them beyond the respect we show to any great human achievement. Human works are not revealed, but rather inspired works, sometimes by the devil himself. Do not limit your reading only to those written in your own faith tradition. The Prophet listened, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and appreciated Jahili poetry. He praised the knowledge of the Persians and inclined greatly towards the Christians, conveying the Quran's acknowledgement of the nearness of their faith to ours due to their humility and that they display an emphasis on love. He is reported to have said, seek knowledge even unto China. Beware of being too critical without understanding a work. So the initial reading should always be charitable. Criticism demands a rigorous level of reading and understanding. One must first come to terms with the author. Come to terms, like that is from logic. You have to understand the terms that they're using. And then discern the arguments, assessing their strengths and weaknesses. For this reason, logic is an indispensable tool to real learning that enables one to ascertain the validity or invalidity of an author's assertions. Finally, the greatest and most important aspect of a tradition is its foundation. In the Western tradition, its ground has always been the revelation of the Jewish and Christian tradition. These people are honored in the Quran as people of the book, something that the Jewish writer Adam Kirsch, in his introduction to a remarkable book entitled The People and the Books, takes as a badge of pride in the introduction. I got this book recently. In the introduction, he takes as a badge of pride the Quranic designation of the Jews as people of the book, and remarks that although the designation is not theirs, it's not the Jews, but from the Quran, they have long embraced it as their identity as people of the book. For Muslims, however, our foundational text will always be the Quran. The Quran for centuries was the sine qua non of Muslim education. Its memorization, recitation, contemplation, and above all else, its implementation. Milton has an extraordinary section, and I'll end with this. Milton has an extraordinary section in his Paradise Regained, where the devil tempts Christ with worldly knowledge and his need for that knowledge. Be famous then by wisdom, as thy empire must extend. So extend the mind o'er all the world, in knowledge all things in it comprehend. Satan goes on. All knowledge is not couched in Moses' law, the Pentateuch, or what the prophets wrote. The Gentiles also know and write and teach, to admiration led by nature's light. Satan continues to entice Christ with literature and poetry, and then onto his favorite subject, rhetoric, and back to philosophy. Milton's reply to Satan in the mouth of his subject expresses perfectly a believer's understanding of Revelation. Think not that I know these things, or think I know them not. Not therefore am I short of knowing what I ought. He who receives light from above, from the fountain of light, no other doctrine needs, though granted true. He goes on to refute Satan, arguing that without God, all knowledge and its pursuit is vanity. A vain pursuit that leads to the cul-de-sac of emptiness and nihilism. The existential crises of modern humans who have removed God from the center of their educational pursuits. The fox knows many things, said a wise Greek, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. In the end, to know and love God is our greatest good, and education should be directed toward that goal. A liberal education requires free men and women who, servants, not of themselves, their societies, or the enticements of the world, but rather servants of Allah, who seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave, and who take seriously the command, Iqra, read, but always in the name of your Lord, who taught by the pen what man knew not. So are we going to... Okay, any questions or comments, answers, suggestions? Don't be so long next time. Yeah.
Hey, Brother Usman asks, a question for Shaykh Hamza. What is your advice for studying the classics without a guided teacher? Is studying classics with Western teachers a good idea? And how long should it take, or does it take, to study the classics?
I mean, I would say one of the things one of the reasons why we study the greatest works is because they are examples of excellence, of ihsan. And when you're accustomed to excellence, everything else, it just will not do it for you. If you get used to reading great writers, when you read bad writers, it's painful. And a lot of people cannot write. Academics, modern academics, the writing is just, for me, often unbearable. And when I was doing some courses at GTU, they'd have me read these books that I just found so difficult to read. I found out later that most of the students don't even read them. So, but I actually did read them, and I found them really unbearable. And I remember one conversation where I just told Judith Berlin, I can't take this writing, it's so bad. She said, no, focus on the content. And I said, the form is blinding me from my ability to focus on the content. So it's literature is a source of immense knowledge about the human condition. And so I think reading literature is actually really important. Poetry is important. These are called the humanities for a reason. And so there's a lot of things that you could read on your own once you learn to read. Learning to read is a challenge in and of itself. It takes a long time to become a really good reader. But I would say philosophy I would not go near with a 10-foot pole without being grounded in our tradition. Philosophy is very dangerous. You know, like Sheikh Salih al-Ghursi, one of our teachers, he calls it falsafah. You know, like safah is like idiocy. You know, so and philosophy can be very confusing, but the rigor of the philosophical methodology is very important, and it's used in our sciences. It's used in our kalam, it's used in our usul al-fiqh, and so it is important. So philosophy, when you see all the negative comments about philosophy amongst our scholars, it really was about Greek philosophy. It wasn't about philosophy as a subject. Philosophy is part of life. Whatever you call it, it's part of life. And that's why it's traditionally in our tradition it was called hikmah, which is philosophia, love of hikmah, of wisdom. So you have to have a Muslim scholar who's grounded in Islamic creed to be able to teach our philosophical works. And certainly reading, I mean, one of the things about critical theory, which can be useful as a tool. The problem with critical theory is, what I found with many people who study it, it's not a lens. It becomes a corneal transplant. And they just completely lack the ability to remove it. It's a type of reductionism that reduces everything to power, reduces everything to, humans are very complicated. And to reduce things to very simplistic formula is very dangerous, and you'll end up really making some egregious mistakes about the world. So these are things, we've got students now going into these schools. Many of them are atheistic or agnostic, and some of these teachers are they're sophists. They're very powerful, their arguments are very clever, and Iblis in the Quran, he inspires them with zukhraf al-qawl, right? With ornamented words and ghurur and delusion. So it's really important to study and be firmly rooted in our own tradition. But Aristotle was always part of our tradition after that early period. He had an immense influence on the structure of our knowledge. You can see clearly the transition in our books. From their organizational structures. They just completely, radically transform after the introduction of Aristotelian works into the Muslim world. So and the politics can't be ignored. If you want to really understand politics, you have to read several foundational texts in both our tradition and in the Western tradition. I mean, you have to read Adab ad-Din wa Dunya, you have to read Siraj al-Muluk, Nasihat al-Muluk, Kitab al-Wizara, al-Mawardi's famous text on Ahkam al-Sultaniyya. We have many books. I've got over 20 books on political science. As-Siyasa al-Shar'iyya is a very interesting book by Ibn Taymiyyah. And there's some really important things. He has a very nuanced understanding of working with oppressive governments, right? And the importance of of recognizing that you need government, and there have to be people that do good things in government, and if all the good people abandon government, then he says that it's left to the evil people to run the government. I mean, that was one of Burke's arguments. Burke said that, he said a lot of people did not want to serve because of the corruption, and he said, no, this is the time for good men to serve because of the corruption, right? So, and then in the Western tradition, there's a dialectic that's very interesting. They all wrote books on education. All of these political scientists were very concerned with the education of children because they knew how important that was. Ghazali wrote on the education of children. Muhammad bin Sahnun wrote a very important book on the education of children. So Locke wrote on the education of children, a very important treatise. Also, Machiavelli is very important. Well, our civilization never produced a Machiavelli, but Machiavelli in one of his private letters says part of the reason why he wrote the book was to expose these guys. Like, for you to understand how they work, right? Because he's a realist. It's realpolitik. And then you have, if you look at, like for instance, if you look at Locke and his two treatises, and then you look at Rousseau, Rousseau has a completely different vision of the state of nature than Hobbes. And much of political science deals with what the original state of nature was. So Hobbes has a view, Hobbes, his mother gave birth when the Spanish were invading England, and so she actually had an early birth. So he said he was the twin of fear. And so Hobbes said he was always the first one to run if anything looked dangerous. But self-deprecation notwithstanding, he was a brilliant man, and his concern was civil war because he lived at a horrific time in England. And so he really felt that in many ways our ulama were Hobbesian. because they just saw that rebellion had such immense, it created such immense human suffering. Which is not to say they supported tyrants, they hated tyrants. But Ibn Abul Izz, in his commentary on the Tahawiyya, says that الخروج عن الحاكم حرام لما يترتب عليه من المفاسد, right? ويحصر أضعاف الجور الذي يحصل من الحاكم الجائر. He said the reason that we don't rebel is because the oppression and harm that comes from rebelling ends up being much greater than the original harm that you were rebelling against. And then he said, وَالصَّبْرُ عَنَ الْجَوْرِ سَبَبٌ لِتَكْفِيرِ السَّيِّئَاتِ التي كانت سبب تسليط الجائر علينا بذنوبنا. He said it's the reason why it's a way of removing our sins, and he says أضعاف الأجور, increasing our rewards multiply because of, he says it was the very sins of our community that brought these tyrants over us. The famous dua, لا تسلط علينا بذنوبنا من لا يرحمنا ولا يخافك فينا. Don't subjugate us because of our sins to people that don't fear us and don't fear you and have no mercy. And then he says, فَعَلَى الْمُسْلِمِينَ أَنْ يَشْتَغِلُوا بِالْإِسْتِغْفَارِ وَالتَّوْبَةِ وَإِصْلَاحِ الْعَمَلِ. So the Muslims should really strive to make tawbah to Allah, to rectify themselves, to do these things. And then he quotes several ayahs all about, where tribulation, that it's from our own selves, and كَذَلِكَ نُوَلِّي بَعْضَ الظَّالِمِينَ بَعْضًا بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. He quotes all those verses. And then he says, فَالَّذِينَ يُرِيدُونَ أَن يَتَخَلَّصُوا مِنْ جَوْرِ الظَّالِمِ فَلْيَتْرُكُ الظُّلْمِ. So those people that want to get rid of the oppression of the ruler, let them first get rid of the oppression in themselves, which is in the extraordinary work of Martin Luther King in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he talks about what you have to do if you want to confront the tyrant. He says you have to look into yourself and see, do I have any of the qualities of the tyrant? And you have to do self-purification, or else you don't have the moral capital. And there's a theory called congruence theory by Epstein, which is very interesting. One of the things he says is that tyrannical governments only work in societies where the tyranny is replicated in all of the institutions. So the family's tyrannical, the father's tyrannical, the teachers are tyrannical, the doctors are tyrannical, right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, if my ummah loses, yahabu, like out of fear, they won't say ya zalim. Oh, it's in Al-Hakim in Mustadrak, Sahih Hadith. If my ummah loses the ability to say ya zalim, then he said, tuwaddi'a minhum. Like in another riwayat it says, being under the earth is better than being on top of it. In the commentaries, they say this means not just the hakim, which is the role of the ulama, to say that privately according to the hadith. Man arada an yansah lidhi sultan la yubdi alaniya, right? Don't, if you want to give advice to the sultan, don't do it in public, do it in private. But he says it goes all the way down. You have to be able to say that. If you're in Zaytuna and somebody's acting dictatorial, you have to say, Ya Zalim, what are you doing? That will change the society. That's Epstein's theory of congruence. It has to go all the way down. It can't just be, these people. Anyway, that's something I've been thinking about lately. Yeah. So, any other questions? Sorry for the long-winded answer. Yeah. Any other questions? Everybody's perfectly content, mashallah. Scott, alaikum assalam. Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare is so important, and arguably, I don't think anybody, certainly in Western civilization, understood the human heart like he did. And every archetype is in Shakespeare, including the mystic. If you read As You Like It, you'll find the mystic there. He has every archetype. And people that know, my father who read all 39, which is the apocryphal plays as well, he did that every year for I think 60 years. So he really knew those plays forward and backward. And he was just a really quick study. Like he would get people really quickly because he knew the archetypes really well. So Frost is great, Emily Dickinson's great. Our poets are, I mean, this is where we shine. Like Muslim poets are just stunning, especially our mystical poets. I mean, we have some of the greatest mystical poets. I mean, I would argue the greatest mystical poets in human history. And not just Rumi. Rumi is one among many. The Gulshan Iraz is a masterpiece, and it's well translated in English. It's a beautiful work. You know, I have my preferences, but again, people, like I love Auden, I love Yeats in the 20th century. Frost is, I think, great. Frost, somebody once said to me, you know, about Frost, where's the depth? And that was somebody I knew had never read Frost. Because Frost is a very deceptive poet. And if you want to read the best refutation of evolution ever, and finally scientists are beginning to really recognize the major flaws in evolution, but one of the best is by Frost. He wrote a poem called Accidentally on Purpose. And it's just a stunning refutation of, but you know, he said, where's the depth? And I quoted to him a poem that he entitled The Fear of God. You know, if you should go from nowhere up to somewhere, from being nobody up to being somebody, be sure to keep repeating to yourself, you owe it to an arbitrary God whose mercy to you rather than to others won't bear too critical examination. Stay unassuming. You know, I read in that poem and he was like, whoa, never heard that before. I said, well, you have to read. You know, what we tend to do is read. And, you know, his poem on To Rose Diverse in a Yellow Wood, you know, I read a whole book on that poem. That's how much that poem intrigued me. And the book, this is an example of why some books are worth reading because they're wrong. Because he was so wrong on that poem, I finally felt like I cracked that poem, right? That poem is about free will. That's what makes the difference. Because he repeats I twice. It's very interesting. I took the one less traveled by. He's asserting human volition. That's what makes the difference. Another, you know, reading Brothers Karamazov is stunning. Dostoevsky is just unbelievable, and he deals with so many problems. On my reading list, I mean, these are long books, and you get old, and kind of, these things should be done when you're young, trust me. But you revisit important ones when you're old, because they really have a different experience. Yeah, I was thinking of, anyway, lost my train of thought. So there's a lot. I mean, you know, what we'd like to do here, this is a lifelong project. And inshallah, you will be readers for life. We are a community of iqra. And this is not to deny the life of action. The life of action is very important. But part of why you're here is you get 4 years to think deeply. This is leisure time to think deeply about the problems of the world. So that when you do go out into the world of action, and some of you will choose to be people in that world, like we need activists. I'm not opposed to activism. Activism is an important part of life. You have to have people that, I mean, I met a woman who at a Rohingya fundraiser. This woman has been working on the Rohingya problem for over 15 years. This is not a new problem. We just found out about it. She was working on it for over 15 years. And I asked her, she was a Christian, white American, I asked her, why are you doing this? And she said, nobody else was. I mean, God bless those people. You know, those people are amazing. And you have to honor them. So I interviewed years ago with a Saudi group for Saudi television, Barbara Oshansky, who's half Jewish, half Palestinian, and Michael Ratner, who passed away, you know, is a beautiful Jewish man. And they were working on freeing the people in Guantanamo because they felt that it was extrajudicial, that these people were being treated inhumanely. And when the Saudis asked them, like, why are you doing this? Michael Ratner said, you know, we're doing it because nobody else was doing it. This was a professor at one of the top law schools in the United States, at Columbia University. He was doing this pro bono. And there was another amazing woman from England who was with them. I think her name was Evans. Just really amazing, just so humble. I interviewed all of them, but he said in the Jewish tradition we have something called the Zaddik, you know, Siddiq. And he said, you know, this is the righteous man who does the right thing when others aren't doing it. And he said, I'm just trying to fulfill that mandate. And when we came out, you know, these Saudi youth who had this, you know, kind of just brainwashed about Jews because they, you know, they don't know Jews, they don't, you know, and I mean, Dr. Hatem, who works extensively in this field, knows some of the most staunch supporters of the Palestinian cause are out of the Jewish community. So, because a lot of Jews have a deep sense of justice. So, that's important, but we have a chapter in Al-Bukhari, Bab Al-Ilm Qabla Al-Qawli Wal-Amal, the book of knowledge before action. If you become an activist without having a firm grounding, I'm talking about Muslims, like Muslim activism, without having a firm grounding in your own faith and tradition, one, you're very susceptible to deep burnout because the world, the horrificness of this place, you know, with all of its beauty, I mean, we as believers embrace it all. You know, what in the West we call amor fati, loving our fate. You know, rida bil qada, being content with what Allah has decreed. So we accept everything, the qadar khayrihi wa sharrihi, hulwihi wa murrihi, we accept it. But it can be overwhelming when you're working in these areas and finding out things that are what human beings do, right? I mean, if you've ever seen the pictures of the Nazis at Auschwitz having their picnic and they're all laughing and I mean, these were the guards, the women and men that were like, and they're just, you know, or the banker who dispossesses some person of their home and goes home and has dinner. You know, it's amazing what humans can do on a daily basis. So part of studying these great traditions is that it just helps you understand the world, what it is. And this is a place of great tribulation, but it's also a place of great blessing. And when you're in blessing, you should be working for the people in tribulation, trying to help them and alleviate them in your own little ways. It's not always saving the world, but just people around you. So you have an immense opportunity here, but this is a lifelong project. And there's going to be people from amongst you, I'm hoping most of you, there's going to be people from amongst you that are going to become deeply dyed people of knowledge, scholars, and people that love learning and educating people. And then you go out and you know, help people grapple with the world because you'll have a much deeper understanding of the world. And that understanding will help other people who are struggling. I mean, we have a crisis right now in our community. You know, I follow a group called Ex-Muslims in North America, you know, and they're growing, and their online presence is growing. They're always putting up new videos, and they have new testimonials from people. Oh, I'm so liberated. I'm so glad to be out of Islam, and I feel so wonderful. That's called inshirah shaitan. Right? You know, when you abandon faith, people get a real inshirah, you know. And so our tradition, when the truth comes to you, there's inqibad. In fact, in the Catholic tradition, one of the laws of discernment is very often demonic presences create a sense of expansion. And the deep spiritual tradition of discernment is often the opposite. You have an intense constriction that's followed by an expansion. Right? Zamiluni, zamiluni. Alhamdulillah. So Barakallah fikum. I'm looking forward to this series, inshallah. I hope, what I'm hoping is we look at some of these great books, examine them, look at the architecture of the book, what makes it great, and why it's relevant, and why we're studying it. So, Barakallah fikum, subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. And thank all of you that were online, whoever was there. Assalamu alaikum.
Conversation that Safir and I were having. They wanted to call it what are called a speaker series or a lecture series. And I insisted, of course, on calling it a lecture series for this very reason. I think with Zaytuna, one of the main crafts, so we look at teaching as a craft, and one of the main practices that a teacher should be able to do, and the highest form of teaching, is giving a lecture. And that's unpopular nowadays. I've experienced certain professors, and their understanding of good teaching is they model the late night comedy shows in a physics class, And here we used to lecture, and so we insisted on the lecture. That's exactly what we had today, alhamdulillah. And our a sign of us wanting to study and wanting to become, inshallah, part of this